It was an ordinary Friday night in Austin, Texas, until a call came in about a fire at a local yogurt shop. After firefighters forced their way inside and put out the flames, they found the bodies of four teenage girls: 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, her 15-year-old sister Sarah, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. They were discovered bound with their own clothing, stripped, and each shot in the back of the head. This was a quadruple homicide. Investigators later determined that two different firearms had been used, pointing to more than one killer. Witnesses recalled seeing two men inside the shop that night who were the last to leave, but as of today, they have never been identified. From the beginning, the investigation into who was behind this horrific crime was riddled with false confessions, failed prosecutions, and just endless theories. 33 years and 8 months later, the case remains unsolved. And now, a new HBO docuseries is revisiting the case, interviewing detectives, witnesses, and family members, all in hopes of shedding light on the case again and finally uncovering the truth after all these years. What really happened that night? Who was inside the shop with the girls? And what needs to happen for justice to finally be served? Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing super well. Thank you all so much for being here with me today and for taking the time to listen to this video. Today we're going to revisit a case that I've covered before, but this time from a different perspective. HBO has recently released a 4-part documentary series called The Yogurt Shop Murders, bringing this heartbreaking case back into the media. We're going to be talking about what happened to Jennifer Ann Harbison, to her sister Sarah, to Eliza Hope Thomas, and to Amy Lee Ayers. I want to go over what the documentary reveals, especially the voices of the victims' families, and just why it's so important that this case doesn't fade away. I'll have my first video on the case linked down below if you guys want a more in-depth look into who the victims were, their lives, and the investigation from the very beginning. But today I want to discuss what the docuseries talks about, how 33 years later this case still remains unsolved, and how the fight for justice continues. We're going to be looking at what the investigators shared in their interviews, the perspectives of legal experts who have analyzed the case, and the reflections from the victims' families. Every new spotlight on the case gives them hope that someone out there will finally come forward, or that science will deliver the answers that they've been waiting for more than 33 years. That being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this case, and for listening to the lives of these four beautiful girls, and for keeping their names alive. It's just so important to continue spreading awareness on what happened to these four beautiful human beings because, they deserve justice and their families deserve closure. With that, let's jump right into today's video. On the night of December 6, 1991, in Austin, Texas, homicide detective John Jones was out on a special ride-along with the Channel 7 news reporter who was working on a series about murder in Texas. The camera crew followed John as he responded to calls, and coincidentally, that night turned out to be the night of one of Austin's worst homicide cases, the Yogurt Shop murders. Just before midnight, John got a call about a robbery homicide with 3 fatalities. But as John was pulling into the parking lot of the shop, they told him that a 4th body was found. John recalls having to enter the yogurt shop through the party store that was next door because firefighters were at the front still putting out the fire. When he walked in, the shop was dark, covered in water and smoke, and steam was everywhere. It was as if everything was almost gray, almost black and white. As it began to clear out, the bodies of the 4 girls became visible. 3 were stacked together, and 1 was further away. John says he didn't want the medical examiner to remove the bodies from the very contaminated crime scene and take them to the morgue to do an autopsy. He wanted to wait for the Department of Public Safety to get there first, get swabs from the bodies, and just do it right then and there at the crime scene since, these were very young women who were found stripped and possibly sexually assaulted. So John knew that finding DNA was very important, and the sooner they did this, the better. Now, DNA was fairly new at this time, but still, John knew that this was important to do right now. Homicide investigator Mike Huckabee, a fellow lead in the case, was the one who actually helped make that happen. So they wanted to recover whatever they could from the bodies ASAP, and most importantly, identify these victims as soon as possible and inform their families. Authorities contacted the yogurt shop's manager, Reese Price, so that she could come down to the scene and help identify the bodies. In the docuseries, Reese recalls how that night unfolded for her. She was only 24 years old at the time and just remembers that night so clearly because it was supposed to be the first night of her vacation, but it ended abruptly when there was a knock at her door. It was her mother-in-law who came in to tell her that she had a phone call from the police. Reese thought to herself, like, okay, this is not good. A call in the middle of the night from the police is never a good sign. On the phone, officers explained that there had been a fire at the yogurt shop and they urged her to, take a seat before they continued. Reese thought to herself, like, okay, well, it's just a fire. Like, I don't really need to sit down for this. And she told them, like, no, it's fine. Just tell me what's going on. That's when the officer said, we found 4 dead bodies. Reese recalls everything around her just seemed to move in slow motion after hearing those words. She drove straight to the shop, and as she pulled up, she saw the chaotic scene with flashing lights, firefighters, and officers everywhere. Sirens were blaring, and the media was already gathering outside, so, she was a little bit panicked as she got out of her car. The police asked her if she would be able to identify the bodies if they went into the shop together, and she said yes. They told her, it would be better if she identified them, instead of the parents having to look at their loved ones in this state because, the bodies were badly burned. So Reese thought to herself, like, okay, yeah, they got a point. Like, it's better that I do it than the family. So she walked into the shop and she said that it was dark and heavy with smoke. Water dripped from the ceiling and splashed around her feet. She described it as just ominous. The girls' bodies were so badly burned that she actually couldn't identify them. It was horrible to see and to know that even though they were unrecognizable, those were 2 of her employees. She worked with them frequently, saw their smiles on their faces, and now they were in this horrific state. It was just so sad. Eventually, the girls were taken out of the shop in body bags, and outside, reporters pressed for answers, but detectives held back. They knew that false confessions and fake tips could derail the case, so autopsy results and just specific crime scene details were kept sealed. John Jones made it clear, nothing could be released. The 4 victims were eventually identified through dental records, and they were identified as 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, her 15-year-old sister Sarah, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, and 13-year-old Amy Ayers. In my first video, I shared who the girls were, their lives, their hobbies, and their families, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, I want to take a moment to talk about their lives before we move forward. It's important to know who these girls were. We'll start with Eliza. Eliza Hope Thomas was born on May 16, 1974, to her parents Maria and James, and she had a younger sister named Sonora. At the time of her death, she was a senior at Lanier High School, and she was really active in Future Farmers of America, a youth organization that prepares its members for leadership, personal growth, and career success through agricultural education. She was so loved by her family, and she shared a really close bond with her mother Maria and with her sister Sonora, who just absolutely adored her. One of her mom's favorite memories was watching Eliza and her best friend Michelle get ready for nights out country dancing and just like taking pictures together before leaving the house and just, being typical teenage girls. Apart from wanting to become a vet, Eliza had dreams of modeling and she wanted to build a portfolio, so she decided to get a job. She applied at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt and was hired at the counter. After working there for about a year, she earned a promotion to shift leader. She just really enjoyed the job. She loved earning her own money and was looking forward to buying her first car, which she actually did accomplish. She bought a green junkie car that she was nonetheless very proud of, and she actually asked for car parts as a Christmas gift. Eliza's younger sister Sonora was just 13 years old when her entire world fell apart. She remembers being at her father's house the night that the police came. They banged on the door, but they were very vague, only saying that there had been a fire and that something had happened to Eliza. Then came the words that shattered her life. Eliza was gone. Sonora's body reacted instantly. Her teeth chattered so violently that she had to put her hand in her mouth to stop it. Now, because her parents were divorced, she and her father had to go to her mother's house, Maria, to break the news to her. When they told Maria, Maria was just, of course, absolutely devastated. She wouldn't even step outside to face the police, and instead, she just locked herself away in her room and just wanted to be alone. Sonora's dad told her to take care of her mom, and then he just left, and Sonora was just left there, wondering what to do next. She was only 13 years old. Her mom was locked away in a room, and she didn't know what to do. So in order to cope, she just started cleaning the house. It was the first instinct that she had, so she just started cleaning the counters, cleaning everything. She eventually turned on the news, and that's when she saw her sister's name scroll across the television, and that's when reality sank in. Later, as she went to bed that night, she thought to herself, I've never woken up on a day that my sister wasn't alive. There's no Sonora without Eliza. There's no Eliza without Sonora.
A backyard wedding in 1989. It was here at her mother's wedding that most of what little home video there is of Eliza Thomas was taken. Cutting up in front of the camera, or some quiet time with mom on the couch, are some of the few video memories there are of 17-year-old Eliza. But there are pictures. lots of pictures of Eliza growing up. Eliza wanted to be a model. She was going to use the money from the sale of her pig at the livestock show to start a modeling portfolio. And she loved country and western music and dancing.
Now, let's talk about Jennifer Ann Sarah. Jennifer Ann Harbison was born on May 9th, 1974, and she was the oldest sibling. She was a senior at Lanier High School and was known as hardworking, social, and just very involved. She served as the president of the Future Farmers of America program, where she learned to raise and care for animals, and she also managed her school's drill team and competed in track and field. When her parents bought her a car, they told her that she needed to find a job to help pay for it, so she applied at I Can't Believe It's Yogurt, and she was hired as a cashier, and she worked there for over 5 months. So Jennifer and Eliza both worked at the shop, and they just loved working there. Yes, it was a job, but they really enjoyed it. You know, they had a stereo in the back, and they would dance and sing as they did the closing duties, like washing all of the utensils and all of the containers. They were also in charge of restocking items in the back and in the front, like the napkin dispensers, as well as flipping all of the chairs on top of the tables and the booths so that they could sweep and mop. Like I said in my first video, I feel like an ice cream shop or like a froyo shop are super common jobs for high schoolers. I had a lot of classmates who worked at my local yogurt shop. I even had one friend who was the manager of one, and it's just such a simple and fun job as a teenager. Now, let's talk about Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Louise. She was born on October 28th, 1976, and both girls were the only daughters of their parents, Barbara and Mike. Sarah was a freshman at St. Louis Catholic School on a humanitarian scholarship. She was also active in the FFA program alongside Jennifer, where she helped raise lambs for the county livestock show. She just loved being outdoors, she adored animals, and she loved to collect rocks and seashells. Their mother, Barbara, described both girls as wonderful, unique, and just deeply faithful. She also appeared in the docuseries, and she talks about the night where she got the news that both of her children were dead. She was in her room watching Star Trek, and she eventually drifted off on top of the covers until she felt her husband crawl into bed a little bit later. She says that she was half asleep, not fully out, when suddenly the doorbell rang, which startled her. At first, she thought it was maybe the girls, maybe they forgot their keys or something like that. But then she saw police officers on her front porch. They entered the room and they sat Barbara and her husband down on the couch and told them that there had been a fire at the yogurt shop and that her 2 girls were gone. Barbara said that at that moment, it just didn't make sense. Her 2 daughters being burned and dead was something that she couldn't even process. She was trying to understand what the police were telling her, but she just couldn't. Now, the police could see how difficult they were taking this in, and they told Barbara and her husband that they wouldn't leave until someone else came to stay with them. But at this point, Barbara didn't want to tell anyone what happened. She wasn't ready to tell anyone that her daughters were dead, so she lied to the police and told them that she had no friends or family nearby. Police still wouldn't leave the house, so eventually she admitted that yes, she had a sister in town and her sister was called over. She then had to tell her sister that her 2 nieces were gone. After that, she had to call the girl's father, Mike, and deliver the horrific news. She listened as Mike screamed in shock and in grief, and at one point, Mike had to pass the phone over to his wife because he just couldn't bear it anymore. Barbara said that it was just absolutely horrible. That night changed their lives forever. She says that 2 weeks after her daughter was murdered, the media went to her house for an interview and they asked her why she wasn't crying. Barbara said it was because she had nothing left. There were no more tears left to cry. She was just absolutely broken.
Jennifer on the right was 17. Sarah was 15. Home videotapes give us intimate glimpses of the girls and their personalities. Sarah, number 52, loved the game of basketball.
She was a cheerleader in the 8th grade, so she would go to a ball game and the girls would play, and then she'd run back into the locker rooms and change into a cheerleading outfit and come out and cheer for the boys' game.
Jennifer also had a job.
As a matter of fact, this is Jennifer's pin from the yogurt store for her uniform. I didn't even know that was here.
Jennifer and Sarah shared a passion, FFA, raising sheep.
And the funny thing is, they really just love those animals in the first and second place because they just loved them. They
just pictures of them just kissing them on the face and nose to nose with these lambs.
They're so funny. Gosh, they're funny.
Frank and Barbara erected a shrine in their home to honor the girls. The table is littered with pictures and memories. They still do not believe their girls are gone. They know someday the killers will be caught.
Now, let's talk about Amy. Amy Lee Ayers was born on January 31st, 1978, to her parents Bob and Pam, and she had an older brother named Sean. At the time of her death, Amy was an 8th grader at Burnett Middle School, and she was also active in the FFA program, where she became really close friends with Sarah Harbison through their shared love of animals. Growing up around ranches that her dad managed, she developed a deep passion for caring for animals and dreamed of one day owning horses and becoming a vet. She competed in livestock shows at the Travis County Fair and Rodeo, showing hogs and even winning the arts and craft division. Amy also loved going to the rodeo with her brother Sean and just spending time outdoors, especially when it involved animals. Amy's father, Bob, also spoke in the docuseries, and he says that when he thinks of Amy, he thinks of horses because she loved them so much and she just knew how to connect with them. Her mom, Pam, says that Amy was the happiest around animals, and watching the documentary, Amy looks just like her mom, Pam. It's really just beautiful to look at Pam speak about her daughter, and you can just see Amy in her. Amy loved cats and horses so much, and it's just clear that all of these girls were absolutely loved by their families and by their friends.
If there was ever anyone who was nearly born in the saddle, it was Amy Ayers. Raised on ranches in Cleburne and Jacksboro, Amy was a little self-conscious about being a cowgirl when her family moved to Austin in 1985.
Used to kind of bother her because she was always a country girl, and I told her, I said, you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl.
What does this room reflect of her?
Well, I think it shows you some of her interests. George Strait, he's on every wall here in the room. She was an animal lover. She really loved cats, and horses were probably her favorite of the animals. We've got stuffed animals of all kinds to go with that. She spent a lot of time in here just by herself, played her stereo with all of her country western music. She's always liked country western. Has never been a rock and roll fan. And would do her homework in here sitting at her desk with her country music going.
Amy's birthday 2 years ago. At 12, she was already showing signs of camera shyness.
Here comes Amy Ayers from here. Amy Ayers, all right,
Her love of animals took her to the FFA. She raised and sold pigs at the Austin-Travis County Livestock Show. And it was through the FFA that she became friends with Jennifer and Sarah Harbison.
They just hit it off from the first time they met, and then once that happened, you didn't see one without the other at the livestock show. You didn't have to worry about those two when they were together. You knew that they were going to have a good time, but you didn't have to worry about what they were going to get into. They were going to be safe in what they did. They had a ball together, laughed and giggled, and really a good time.
And it's so heartbreaking that they had to say their final goodbyes at the girls' joint funeral. It was a few days later on December 10th, and over 1,500 people attended. It began with a mass where 1,000 people were packed inside the church, and another 500 were outside on the lawn. Everyone, whether it was the girls' friends or strangers who never even met them, showed up just to pay respect and show support for the families. After the mass, the procession to the grave began, which stretched over 5 miles. At the cemetery, the families had to say their final goodbyes. Now, Detective John Jones was a parent himself, so he understood the pain that all of the families were feeling. He promised to do all that he could to help them, and he actually made a pledge to the families. The night of the murders, he pulled up to the scene wearing a green and white shirt that he bought, and he told the families that the next time he wore that same shirt, it would be the day that the case was finally solved. But before he could pull out that green and white shirt again, he knew that he had a long and difficult investigation ahead of him. So what did investigators piece together about what actually happened inside the yogurt shop that night? Well, based on the family statements and eyewitnesses, they were able to put together a timeline, so let's talk about it. On the night of the murders, Jennifer dropped her sister Sarah and her friend Amy at the North Cross Mall before her shift at the yogurt shop, which wasn't a huge inconvenience or anything since the mall was only like 2 blocks away from her job, so it was just an easy drive. After Jennifer dropped them off at the mall, she then headed to the yogurt shop to begin her shift shift alongside Eliza. After that, the plan was simple. Jennifer and Eliza would close the shop at 11 p.m. while Sarah and Amy hung out there waiting for Jennifer to drive them home afterward because Amy was going to have a sleepover at their house. So when the mall closed, Jennifer picked the girls up and brought them back to the yogurt shop so that they could wait for her to finish up. Everything was normal that night. The shop was busy with weekend customers, and Eliza's mom even stopped by to check in on her around an hour or so before their shift ended. She also remembered seeing Sarah and Amy coming into the shop around that same time with a pizza for all the girls to share. So again, everything seemed normal. It was a Friday night and the girls just wanted to get out of there, so Sarah and Amy actually helped with the closing duties. That way the girls could finish up quicker and everyone could just go home. But tragically, the girls would never make it out of the shop. Not long after closing, the shop went up in flames. When firefighters managed to put out the fire, they saw a horrific scene in the back of the shop. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy were found stripped, bound with their clothing, and shot in the back of the head. It was determined that 2 different firearms had been used, suggesting 2 people were behind the crime. 3 of the girls were found close together on the floor, almost stacked on top of each other, with one of them likely being pushed off the others by the intense water pressure force being used to put out the fire by firefighters, or maybe one of the girls was accidentally nudged on accident by the firefighters trying to put out the flames. So we're not sure how one of the girls, was slightly off. It is believed though that they were stacked together. However, 13-year-old Amy was found separated from the rest of the group, and it's believed that she was never stacked with them. It's believed that she had survived the first gunshot and tried to crawl away before being killed with the second, given that her arms were stretched out in front of her and she was found on her stomach, again as if she was trying to crawl away. There was also evidence that at least one of the girls was essayed. This was a brutal scene. It was a quadruple murder. From the start, investigators leaned toward the idea that it might have been a robbery that spiraled out of control. They thought this because the front door was still locked, from the inside when they arrived, but the back door was open and money was missing from the cash register. The theory was that whoever went in was expecting an easy theft, but then suddenly realized that the shop wasn't completely empty. From there, everything just turned violent. Still, there was no way to know for certain if this was truly how the night unfolded, but investigators had to figure out what happened and who was responsible right away. From the very beginning, investigators faced challenges. They knew that the fire had been deliberately set, but it destroyed almost everything inside the shop. Investigators also believed that the murders took place in the back of the shop, that the 4 girls were likely forced onto their knees and shot in the back of their head. The back door, like I said, was propped open, and cardboard boxes and paper supplies and styrofoam cups were found randomly placed over the girls' bodies, which suggested that they were used as a base for the lighter fluid in the arson that followed. The victims' bodies were badly burned, and any potential forensic evidence was either destroyed or heavily compromised. Firefighters had also used massive amounts of water to put out the fire, which washed away fingerprints, DNA, and any other trace evidence. There was almost nothing found at the crime scene that could be used to find out who did this. Investigators relied almost entirely on eyewitness accounts. One that stood out was from a former police officer named Daryl Croft, who went into the shop at around 10 p.m. with 2 friends. While waiting in line, a man in a military-style jacket approached him, oddly asking if he was a police officer and offered to let him go first in line. Daryl declined, and when the man ordered, he only bought a soda, then walked, behind the counter towards the back of the store. Daryl found this suspicious, and when it was his turn to order, he asked Eliza, who was working the register, where the man went. She told him that the man had asked to use a restroom, which if you guys look at the diagram here on the screen, you can see that the restroom was, kind of towards the back of the shop. Daryl just thought this was odd, so he waited a few more minutes to see if the man returned, but eventually Daryl left without seeing him again. He later described the man as a white male, about 6 feet tall, mid to late 20s, medium build, dark hair, clean shaving with a deep voice and a long pointed nose. Other customers also noticed 2 men that didn't seem to belong. They were sitting in a booth and they only bought 1 soda between them and they didn't order any yogurt. Witnesses say that they were sort of whispering to each other and like hovering over the table to get close to each other's faces so that they could speak without anyone else hearing them, and described one of the men as around 5'6", dirty blonde hair, late 20s to 30s, and the other man as bigger. Both were wearing heavy coats, one a green army-style jacket and the other a black one. This could be the same man that Daryl saw. Crime scene photos later supported these accounts of the 2 men sitting in a booth because nearly every table at the shop had the chairs stacked on top as part of the closing cleanup, except for one booth. That same booth's napkin dispenser was also empty, unlike the others that had been refilled. Investigators believe that this is because the two men were still sitting there as the girls began cleaning up and, closing the shop, preventing them from cleaning that specific table or refilling that napkin dispenser because the two men were sitting there. Despite detailed descriptions and multiple witness accounts, detectives have never been able to track down or identify the two suspicious men seen in the shop that night, who may be the key to solving this case. And just 1 week after the murders, authorities got what seemed to be a solid lead. On December 14th, 1991, a 16-year-old boy named Maurice Earl Pierce went to the North Cross Mall and walked around with a loaded gun in the waistband of his jeans and also had bullets in the pockets. Beside him was his friend, 15-year-old Forrest Welburn. Of course, this caught people's attention. Police were looking for someone with a .22 pistol, and here was this teenager walking with one around the mall just 2 blocks away from where one was used to murder 4 girls. So this could be a lead. Maurice was arrested and taken into questioning by a homicide detective named Hector Polanco for hours. After that questioning, John Jones stepped in and he took down Maurice's written statement. He wasn't in the room when Hector was interrogating Maurice, so he didn't know what Maurice, had told Hector. So when he was getting Maurice's written statement, this was the first time he was hearing this. In the written statement, Maurice claimed that the .22 gun on him was the same gun used in the yogurt shop murders. He said that the day of the murders, he was at the North Cross Mall with Forrest for a little bit, then he left and met up with 2 other friends, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, both 17 years old. He said all of them then went for a drive to some trails where they shot the gun because apparently Michael and Robert wanted to. He said later that night, Forrest borrowed his gun, disappeared for a bit, and later when they met back up, he said that Forrest appeared sweaty, had scratches on his arms, and smelled like hairspray, which, as we know, hairspray can be used to start a fire. He said that Forrest told him that he was the one who killed the girls, telling him, "I did something bad." Maurice also mentioned a trip that he took to San Antonio that he, Forrest, Robert, and Michael had taken the night after the murders in a stolen Nissan Pathfinder. Now, the reason that they went to San Antonio was to visit Michael's girlfriend at the time, who he met at music camp. So they went around to San Antonio for a bit, they hung out there, they came back to Austin, and later that evening at around 8:30 p.m., Forrest came back to Maurice's house on his bike and asked if he could borrow the gun again. Maurice said that he told him no and asked why he wanted it. According to him, Forrest replied saying, quote, "I want to go do what I did last night, go kill some more girls." Maurice explained that by then he already knew about the yogurt shop murders because his sister's friend's husband was a firefighter, and he had described how many of the firefighters at the scene became physically ill from what they saw. Maurice said that Forrest was standing right there when his sister shared the story about that. So Maurice then told him, "You did not kill those girls." And Forrest allegedly responded by saying, "Yes, I did. I got a hold of one of the girls and effed her." Now, if Maurice's account to police was true, it meant that investigators had to act quickly. So the following day, investigators taped a wire on Maurice's chest and sent him out driving with Forrest, hoping that Forrest would slip up and say something incriminating. In the docuseries, we get to actually hear the conversation that the two had. Police told Maurice to, keep things casual, to not drive too fast, to not act suspiciously, and just let the conversation flow. So once Maurice met up with Forrest, he asked him what he actually did that Friday night. Forrest seemed confused and asked what he meant. Maurice reminded him when he said that he wanted to use the gun and when he told him that he killed the 4 girls. Forrest pushed back immediately and said that he had no idea what Maurice was talking about. So Maurice pressed him again and asked, "Well, were you joking around when you said that, or why did you do that?" Forrest stayed silent for a few seconds before saying he was just playing, that he was just obviously joking. But still, Maurice didn't let it go. He told him to not joke like that again and asked point blank, "Did you or did you not kill those girls?" Forrest denied it again, saying, "No, I did not kill those girls." Maurice then asked why Forrest ever said that in the first place, and Forrest told him that, it was just the two of them messing around saying nonsense. Maurice said that he hoped he was telling the truth, and Forrest assured him, telling him, "I wouldn't lie to you." After this, Maurice continued trying to get something out of Forrest, and he pressed him further about the gun, asking, well, who else could have had it that night? But Forrest said nothing. Then Maurice reminded him that he did slip away for some time that night, but again, Forrest swore that he never left with the gun and never had it in his possession for more than a few minutes. Maurice warned him that if the gun came back as the murder weapon, he was the one that was going to be blamed. But Forrest insisted that there was no way the gun could have been used in the killings. And finally, Maurice asked him to swear on his life that he did not kill the 4 girls, and Forrest swore on it. Despite all of Maurice's pressing, Forrest never admitted to anything. So the hidden wire operation gave investigators nothing. When police brought Forrest in for questioning, John said that Forrest, quote, couldn't organize a 2-car parade, basically saying that he was not capable of hiding something like murder from the police. As for fellow lead homicide investigator Mike Huckabee, he said that he really felt Maurice was their guy and that he felt that in his gut. He just knew that he was the killer. But still, they had to prove it. They couldn't go off just, a gut feeling. They needed a confession and they needed evidence. But at this time, they had nothing. They had no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. Detectives questioned all 4 of the young men that Maurice mentioned in his, confession, which again was him, Forrest, Robert, and Michael. But at that time, they were all let go because police had no physical evidence against any of them. Investigators even conducted a test to see if Maurice's gun matched the ballistics at the crime scene, and the test came back as inconclusive. So again, there was nothing. It was back to square one. Detectives tried just about everything to generate leads. They even sent undercover officers to the girls' funerals wired with hidden microphones, hoping that someone would approach, one of the family members and slip up, say something incriminating or, apologize to them. Every customer who had been in the yogurt shop that night was interviewed multiple times. However, there had been some people that paid with cash, and those customers were more difficult to track down. With no surveillance footage to rely on, investigators had to depend entirely on witness accounts. In some cases, they even put customers under hypnosis by a forensic hypnotic. From those sessions, they created composite sketches, including one of a man seen sitting in his car outside the store before the murders. Despite these efforts, no solid information surfaced. Rewards were offered, billboards went up across Austin, and signs were plastered on taxis and buses, urging anyone with information to come forward. The family supported this visibility. They wanted their daughters' faces everywhere, as a reminder that these girls lived in the city that they were murdered, and that whoever was responsible was still out there and needed to be caught as soon as possible. 1 month after the murders, on January 6, 1992, police announced a task force had been created to tackle the case. It was led by senior homicide investigator Hector Polanco, who I mentioned earlier, and this task force included the Austin PD, the Austin Fire Department, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the Department of Public Safety, the Travis County Sheriff's Department, the DA's office, and even the FBI. The FBI actually put together a possible profile of the killers that was released to the public. According to their analysis, they believe that the offenders were most likely white and in their late teens to mid-20s. They said that if they are older, then they likely function emotionally and socially within that age range, and were probably drinking or using drugs before and after the murders. The main offender, or the mastermind behind the crime, was described as an underachiever, likely a high school dropout or poor student, a constant discipline problem who clashed with authority. He was impulsive, quick to anger, and the type to only pick fights he knew he could win, often needing his friends around for backup and manipulating them into doing whatever he told them to. He probably had no steady job, bouncing between low-level work, often skipping shifts, and relying financially on family. His appearance would come off as rough or, thuggy, with little effort in grooming or clothes. The FBI also thought that he likely had a criminal record and a history of being abusive in relationships, often targeting younger girls. They believed that he was local, that he knew the area around the yogurt shop well, and may have even returned to the scene that night to watch the police and the firefighters. After the murders, this group likely went somewhere safe to clean up or change, and the stress of what they had done would have kept them close together, checking on each other out of paranoia, but also saying that that same paranoia could eventually turn into fighting and distrust within the group, leading one of the participants twins to finally tell someone else, get it off their chest, and hopefully that person would come forward and tell the authorities. The FBI also thought that they may have skipped work in the days after the murders, or if they did show up to work, it would be just to avoid suspicion. There was also the possibility that they left town temporarily, giving excuses that sounded legitimate at the time. The reward for any information started at $25,000 and was later raised to $100,000. After this, so many tips were called in. Detectives were getting calls all day, every day, and with each tip, they had to follow up and investigate it. And this took a lot of time. Detective Huckabee said that there were only 6 people in the homicide office at this time, and that the tips grew and grew into this huge pile of paperwork. They weren't only working on the yogurt shop case though. This was in addition to all the other murder cases that they still had to investigate. So it was just a lot of work, and this is when, these theories and speculations began spreading across the city. Theories of money laundering crimes, of satanic rituals. Through these rumors, investigators then primarily turned their attention to who they called PIBs, or people in black, and Creek people. These people were mostly high school and college kids who wore dark clothes, had tattoos, and hung out downtown at dance clubs. Creek people were kids who matched the same description and hung out near the Waller Creek, which wasn't extremely close but also not too far away from North Cross Mall and the yogurt shop, as well as hung out at another creek called Shoal Creek, which this one happened to be literally right behind the yogurt shop. So it was super, super close. It was a spot for teens to hang out, drink, and do stuff that they weren't supposed to be doing. People in Austin who fell into these descriptions were being woken up in the middle of the night, taken to the police station, searched, polygraphed, and sometimes even directly accused of being the killer. Police were getting tips from other people pointing fingers at people, being like, oh, that kid is into witchcraft, or that kid likes dark movies, or that kid likes to wear dark clothing. And from there, this list was made, and police began locating those kids and questioning them about the murders. One kid said that police flat out told him that he was the killer, however, was let go after they admitted that they couldn't prove it. Gavin Garcia, a local writer who police pegged as kind of like the PIB spokesperson, said that he was interrogated 3 times for 6 hours each time, and he knew at least 50 others who went through the same thing. Even entire rock bands were questioned just because their band name sounded sketchy. The whole, I guess you could call it, like a goose chase, reached a breaking point in February of 1992 when police raided the home of a girl named Claire LaVey. 48 hours were tipped off, and they caught the raid on film, showing police handcuffing Claire naked while TV crews zoomed in the dark artwork inside her home. They zoomed in her belongings. They were saying that Claire was the ringleader of a devil-worshipping group in Austin, and said that the people in Austin were telling police that she was behind the yogurt shop murders. In the end, she wasn't the killer. She just had particular likes and interests. So the case against her was dropped immediately. And Claire was actually in the new docuseries, and she speaks out about this traumatic incident. She said that detectives took a lot of things from her house, and she showed the docuseries crew the plastic skull that they also took because they believed that it was like a real skull, when in reality it was fake, it was rolled in dirt, had suede on it, and hair stuck to it to make it look real. She explained how her name ended up on a short list of suspects. At the Europa bookstore, which carried books on the occult and sexual deviancy, FBI agents would wait by the shelves, and if someone walked into that specific section, they would flash a badge and start asking questions of like, do you know this person or this person, reading off a list of about 7 names. Well, Claire's name was on this list. Knowing police would probably search her house, she decided to, make a point. She placed that fake skull that I just mentioned in a box, hoping that when officers found it, they would see it and be like, oh my gosh, this is so silly, we're being so absurd right now, and just realize how misguided their investigation had become. However, she never expected 48 hours to be with the police when they showed up to raid her house. She never expected to be shown getting arrested, taken out of the house naked, or for the police to go through all of her things and have the media in her home unwillingly. At this point, the task force became consumed by what was essentially a witch hunt, targeting teenagers who looked different or didn't fit in with the rest of Austin. This only fueled wild rumors across the city. It fueled stories that chickens had been stuffed into the girls' bodies or that pentagrams were painted in blood at the scene. I mean, none of this was true, and investigators already knew that the murders weren't satanic. Still, some believed that their fixation on the so-called so-called PIBs, the outcasts in a way, wasted valuable time and energy that could have gone towards other leads. The same month as the 48-Hour Crew and the Claire LaVey scandal, the girls' families gathered at a music studio to hear local celebrities sing a song written in memory of the girls called We Will Not Forget. Some of the lyrics say, I watch you lying there, you have my eyes and hair, I love your laughs, your coos and sighs, the answer to my prayer. We will not forget the time we had to share, we will not forget your dreams you'll never dare, we will not forget. I think that was a very nice and just beautiful thing to do, and just a beautiful way to keep Jennifer, Sarah, Amy, and Eliza's names alive. Despite, the scandals and the chaos in a way surrounding the investigation and the drama behind it, at the end of the day, we need to remember that these 4 beautiful girls lost their lives in a brutal way and that their justice is what truly matters. It was just a lot going on at the time with the news of like the satanic rituals and the news of the PIBs. There was just so much going on. And while all of this is going on, the families just want to focus on the investigation and they just want to focus on their girls. So this song was a beautiful way to, keep the girls' names out there, and proceeds of the song went to a foundation to help solve the case and to prevent crime through education and counseling. People in the community felt the case was so close to their hearts and they really rallied together to support the families during this horrible time. Candlelit memorials were held where classmates and friends recalled memories they had with them. The phrase, we will not forget, became the symbol of the tragedy, and it was printed on mugs, t-shirts, pins, and carried at marches throughout the city. Everywhere you looked, people were finding ways to keep the girl's name alive and to make sure that they would never be forgotten. People left flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten letters, and small gifts around it. A few months later, in June of 1992, Eliza and Jennifer were supposed to graduate from high school. When that date came, the school left 2 seats empty in their honor during the ceremony. The docuseries also talks about what Amy's school did in her honor, and Laura Gonzalez from Burnett Middle School shows the crew the 1992 yearbook that was dedicated to Amy, as well as her time capsule that was buried in the school's courtyard in her memory on what would have been her 14th birthday. Students hung up posters that said, "Happy birthday, Amy," and they all signed them and left messages for her, while the principal revealed the memorial tree and the plaque in her honor. Today, Laura says that the time capsule buried there has started to become, above ground, which Laura says could be because it wasn't properly buried or just due to changes in the earth. The time capsule is near a tree trunk next to the memorial stone that has her name and reads, "You have touched our hearts and lives. Your memory will live on forever." Eventually, the time capsule was finally open, and Amy's family was there to witness it. Her father and her brother helped dig it out of the ground, revealing a white PVC-like tube. Inside, much of the contents had been damaged by moisture. Newspapers and letters were damp and fragile, but some items had survived. Among them were ribbons that had been tied to trees the day the capsule was first buried, along with photographs. For Amy's family, holding those pieces after so many years was a really emotional and sentimental moment. I wasn't able to find details about a specific memorial held for Sarah. However, Lanier High School as a whole was deeply affected by the loss of their classmate. The students and the staff honored them in daily ways through school-wide activities, posters with their names, and by keeping their memories present throughout the school, which I think really helped students. It was hard for the entire city of Austin and people were scared. These were 4 young girls who were just at a yogurt shop, a place where you should feel safe, and 2 of the girls were just doing their jobs and the other 2 were just hanging out with them, and then all of a sudden someone walked in and destroyed everything. It was really scary for everyone. People weren't going outside, people were scared to go to work, people were scared to let their teens out and about. Everyone in the city of Austin just wanted the people responsible behind bars so that they couldn't hurt anyone else again. Police, felt this pressure and they just knew that they had to solve this case. They knew they had to shift their focus and they went back to square one essentially. They were working as hard as they could, but were also dealing with so many false confessions, false tips, and just leads that led to nowhere. And of course, endless amounts of paperwork to sort through. In the docuseries, John shows the documentary crew a big box full of investigative material from the case. This included photos of the girls, reports, interviews, etc. And as he's looking through the written confessions, he says, I wasn't the best interrogator, but I was always very good, at being support. He then goes on to say that Hector Polanco, the then lead of homicide for the case, was the one who knew how to interrogate. Hector hadn't had any murder cases go unsolved in the 90s, and John said that he had the reputation of solving the top cases. He was even known as the, quote, Cobra. Now, to give us an idea about how he worked, John talks about a man named Sean Smith, whom Hector Polanco interviewed in 1992 and got a confession out of him for the yogurt shop murders. John said, they all felt good about this confession, and he felt so good about it that he even took the green striped shirt that I mentioned earlier to the office. He was hopeful that he could put the shirt on that day and tell the girls' families that the case had been solved. Investigators truly felt confident that they had a suspect who gave a detailed confession describing what happened and who else was involved. But the story soon began to fall apart, and the details didn't match the evidence at the crime scene. John explained that Hector Polanco had pressured Sean into confessing by convincing him that there was surveillance footage from the gas station across the street. In reality, while there was a gas station and a camera, nothing useful had been captured. With no video and a full confession full of inconsistencies, the lead collapsed, and once again, the case was back at square one. A lot of people just felt, what a waste of time, the fact that Hector lied to him and tried to get this confession just to keep up with his record, and that just wasted so much time and resources. Detective Huckabee said that Hector was very good at interrogating, but that he didn't use that skill correctly. He said that he had seen him interview someone who had nothing to do with the case, but said that he can scare them so much and just make them falsely confess. He said as long as Hector got a confession, he was okay with it, regardless of anything else. Another false lead came from a man named Alex Briones, who claimed that he had stolen between $1,200 and $1,300 from the register the night of the yogurt shop murders. John immediately told Hector that that story wasn't true because the amount that was taken from the register was incorrect. Hector then asked him, well, how much was actually taken that night? But John and Detective Huckabee refused to answer, knowing Hector might use that detail in another interrogation and risk forcing yet another false confession. Detective Huckabee later said that Hector's tactics had seriously damaged the case and wasted valuable time and resources. Just 3 months after the murders in March of 1992, Hector was removed from the task force because of the way that he coerced suspects into confessing. It wasn't until 10 months after the murders in October of 1992 that the media was reporting a breakthrough in the case. There had been another confession. A few months before this, in August of 1992, Austin police were already searching for 3 men indicted in a separate abduction and essay case that had taken place in the city only a month before the yogurt shop murders. The men, Porfirio Carlos, Jose Alberto Cortez, and Ricardo Hernandez, were all in their 20s. The connection to the yogurt shop case came when the homicide unit released a composite sketch of a man seen sitting in his car outside the shop on the night of the murders, and investigators from the sex crimes unit looked at the sketch and immediately thought that it resembled one of the suspects that they were already investigating for a separate incident. So that overlap put the 3 men on homicide's radar as well. Which brings us to October, when Mexican authorities announced the arrest of Porfirio Carlos and Jose Alberto, but as for the 3rd man, Ricardo, he was not found. The news said that these men were arrested and charged in an abduction and case not related to the yogurt shop murders, but that during questioning for, those crimes, they apparently confessed to the girls' murders. At first, when the girls' families heard this, they felt hopeful. Maybe these were the men actually responsible for this, but at the same time, they were also anxious, asking investigators to be absolutely certain. When John and Detective Huckabee reviewed the written confessions, they found major problems. One of the men gave the wrong caliber of the gun, and another claimed that they had poured white gas throughout the shop, which investigators knew wasn't true. Later, Porfirio Carlos said that Mexican authorities had threatened him into confessing to something that he didn't do. Once again, the case fell apart and investigators were back to square one, and it was just really difficult for the family to get hope again and to think like, okay, this is it, like the case is finally solved, this is the killer, the girls are actually going to get justice, and then all of that would just get taken away, and then they were back to square one and having to start all over again. It was just a lot emotionally for the families. Almost 2.5 years after the murders, there was still no solid lead, and this weighed heavy on investigators. John explained that it was the families who first encouraged him to go see a counselor. They could see how heavily the case was weighing on both him and Detective Huckabee. It consumed their every thought, day and night. When John finally went to a therapist, he was diagnosed with PTSD. At first, he was surprised. He didn't realize that you could be diagnosed with something like that unless you were in the war. His symptoms included reoccurring distressing dreams about the case, overwhelming anxiety around anniversaries, difficulty sleeping, sweating, and constant irritability. In the docuseries, John reads through his diagnosis paperwork with a shaky voice and admits that he had avoided looking at it for years because it was too painful to relive. Throughout his time on the investigation, he also divorced from his wife, so there was just a lot going on. Ultimately, in May of 1994, the decision was made for John to leave the yogurt shop case. The chief of police at the time, Bruce Mills, cited burnout and promotions as the reason for the transfer. John said the decision was mutual, but even after stepping away, he was following the case closely and wanted to help whatever way he could. He still felt a personal responsibility to see it solved. And as the years passed, Detective Huckabee also stepped back from the case. A few years later, around 1996, Detective Paul Johnson stepped in to reorganize the case. In the docuseries, he admits that he was hesitant to take on the case. The investigation had gotten, quote, muddy, and most of the homicide unit didn't want to touch it. When Paul's team took over, Sergeant John Jones and Detective Huckabee were pretty much pushed out and criticized for the lack of progress. Detective Huckabee said that he didn't believe either one of them should have been removed from the case, pointing out how much effort they had poured into this and how committed they were to finding answers. They were trying their best. As for John, he said that his biggest regret was losing contact with the families once he was taken off the case. Now, going back to Detective Paul, when he made the decision to really roll up his sleeves and reorganize the case and just get a fresh look at it, he knew that the road ahead would be extremely long. He worked closely with Sergeant Ron Lara, who had been part of the original task force. Together, they faced the daunting task of reviewing more than 2,000 old tips. Each one had to be revisited, evaluated, and ultimately ruled out. There were just so many tips to go through, and while sorting all of this out, they were met with the Maurice Earl Pierce tip again. And as we know, the Maurice tip involved 4 others: Robert Burns Springsteen Jr., Michael James Scott, and Forrest Brooke Wellborn. One thing that immediately stood out was the discrepancy between the records from 1991. So Paul compared John's written notes from Maurice's statements to the actual recording of Hector Polanco's interrogation of Maurice, and the two didn't fully match. Back in 1991, Hector had questioned Maurice for several hours before John entered the room and wrote down Maurice's account. So remember how I mentioned earlier that John wasn't in the room when Maurice confessed? So when he came in to write down the written statement, that was his first time hearing it. Now, years later, Paul saw inconsistencies between what was written and what was actually said on tape. One of the biggest discrepancies between Maurice's written statement and his video interview with Hector came when he described being at Shoal Creek the night of the murders with Michael, Robert, and Forrest. Now remember, Shoal Creek is the creek that is just right behind the yogurt shop. Maurice said that when they arrived, Michael stayed in the back seat, while he, Forrest, and Robert got out. Maurice recalled sitting on the trunk of the car watching as Forrest walked over to another group of guys hanging out nearby. In the interview, he told Hector, quote, Forrest walked over there to those guys and was talking about the gun and started twirling it around. When Hector asked who those guys were, Maurice replied with, quote, that Mac dude or Mace dude. He then claimed that Mac was the one spinning the gun and added, quote, he just said that's when they shot her. They shot her in the head. When Hector asked, who's they? Maurice said, Forrest and Mace. Maurice then told Hector that Forrest said they, quote, lit the bodies up and that they enjoyed watching them burn. However, in John's written statement, Maurice didn't say any of this. So now, Paul, looking at this, he was asking, why Maurice was giving 2 different versions of what happened. The one that he told Hector Polanco on the video interrogation, and then the different one that he told John in his written statement. In the docuseries, Paul says that he believes that Maurice's statements weren't looked at more, perhaps because John was under the impression of well, if even Hector can't make Maurice confess, then maybe Maurice wasn't involved. But now, looking at this later, Paul was thinking even if he didn't confess, the inconsistencies made Maurice look guilty. Paul says, quote, evidently, John Jones never knew the story that Maurice told to Hector Polanco, and Hector Polanco never bothered to look at the written statement and see that it's different from the story that he heard. Anybody you get someone telling a story and they tell one story and then they tell another story, you don't stop until you get it resolved. Why their stories are different. Paul said he actually believed Maurice was the killer after re-examining the case and not Forrest like he was claiming. So he got to work clarifying this. In November of 1998, Paul went to talk to Maurice at his house. The docuseries plays parts of that conversation, and basically Paul reiterates Maurice's initial statements and tells him that they don't match, so they need to figure out which one is the truth, or if either of them is even the truth to begin with. And Maurice says that he doesn't really remember that night, but that he says it was pretty much a normal night. A normal night was going to the mall, hanging out, drinking beer, and just like playing around. Ultimately, Paul got nothing out of Maurice during this interview. He wanted to know if Maurice was really telling the truth about being at the creek that night. So he decided to track down who were there and asked if they remembered seeing Maurice. Many said no, some didn't even know who Maurice was, but a few said yes, that they saw him and even remembered him dropping Forrest off at the creek. So that gave Paul enough to believe that Maurice's story to Hector might have been true, so he started focusing on the others, Robert, Forrest, and Michael. Forrest gave investigators nothing, just like Maurice. But when Michael and Robert were interviewed, everything changed. Let's start with Michael's interview. When asked whose idea it was to target the yogurt shop, Michael said that it was Maurice's. He said, quote, "I remember Maurice saying something about needing money and that he, Robert, Maurice, and Forrest were all in the car that night. He says that he and Robert propped open the back door of the yogurt shop with a pack of cigarettes and that the plan was to go back later to rob the place. He said later Maurice went inside the shop and Michael remembered hearing one of the girls scream, though he wasn't sure if it was a real memory or not. Then he admitted he actually thought he might have killed someone himself. He said that it was a robbery gone wrong. At that point, Michael was read his rights and he was arrested. Investigators then turned to Robert, who had moved to West Virginia just a few weeks after the murders. In his interview, Robert said that on the night of December 6th, he went to go see the Rocky Horror Picture Show, something he often did. But when detectives pointed out that the movie wasn't even playing that night, Robert got really confused. He was like, wait, how was it not playing that night? Like, I feel like I remember going to see it, but detectives were like, nope, it wasn't even playing in theaters. After that, he insisted that he never went near the yogurt shop and he even offered to take a lie detector test. He challenged investigators to prove that he had been there and they told him that they already had eyewitnesses placing him inside the shop. Faced with that, Robert hesitated. He admitted that his version of events might not match what others remembered and began to backtrack. Soon, he started, remembering more details. He claimed that Maurice threatened the girls, demanding money, and saying that he would shoot if they didn't comply. Then Robert said that he himself R-worded one of the girls and fired at one, Amy, who tried to crawl away after being shot. With that statement, Robert too was read his rights and arrested. Both of them shared similar details in their confessions, and I won't go over all of them, but some include telling investigators that after the murders, they threw evidence over the creek bridge nearby, where Michael threw up. And both of them said that Forrest was nothing more than a lookout for the rest of them outside of the store. So with all of this, on October 6, 1999, after two of them confessed and implicated the other two, all four men were arrested for the murders: Maurice, Forrest, Robert, and Michael.
Early this morning, the Austin Police Department, with assistance from other law enforcement agencies, served 4 arrest warrants charging 4 individuals with capital murder. 2 of the 4 arrested were Michael James Scott, Robert Burns Springsteen.
You've been living here in Charleston for quite some time. What have you been doing? Working, living my life.
They got Michael Scott and Springsteen, Robert Springsteen, to sign confessions after long interrogations.
Now, before we continue, I just want to go over who these 4 men were at the time of their arrest and just talk a little bit more about their lives leading up to it. We'll start with Maurice. He grew up attending several schools in Austin. He started at Lamar Middle School, then transferred to Dobie Middle School, and later Robbins Academy, a school that served special education students, dropouts, and those with disciplinary issues. For 9th grade, he enrolled at Anderson High School, but left after only 3 months. After that, district records show no further enrollment. And as we know, when he was 17, Maurice was arrested for carrying a .22 caliber revolver after the 1991 yogurt shop murders. In 1992, he was arrested in Austin for misdemeanor drunken driving and received probation. Years later, in 1999, he was arrested again in connection with the yogurt shop case. By then, Maurice had started a family. He had married his longtime girlfriend, Kimberly, who he had dated for a decade, and together they had a young daughter. Kimberly stood by him, insisting that police had the wrong man. She described Maurice as kind, nonviolent, and incapable of hurting anyone. At the time of his 1999 arrest, Maurice was working warehouse jobs. Now, let's talk about Forrest. People who knew him said that he was kind of wild in his youth, but not known to cause serious trouble, and later became more reserved, mainly interested in motorcycles and dirt bikes. As we know, he was questioned in connection to the yogurt shop murders back in 1991 when he was 15 years old, and after that, the last record of him in Austin schools was in 1993 when he was repeating the 9th grade. Since then, he hadn't really had any run-ins with the law. The only thing is that he pleaded no contest in 1996 to a charge of driving with a suspended license. So at the time of the 1999 arrest, Forrest was working as a mechanic in Lockhart, where he had recently opened his own auto repair business called Lockhart Automotive. So that's Forrest. Now let's talk about Robert. Around 2 weeks after the yogurt shop murders, he dropped out of McCallum High School, where he had been in alternative education classes for students with behavioral problems. So after he dropped out, he moved to West Virginia with his mom and worked a variety of jobs like selling newspaper subscriptions door to door and later managing a McDonald's. Neighbors and his landlord describe him and his girlfriend Robin as friendly, respectful tenants. The couple had moved into the house where he was arrested in 1999. Now, lastly, let's talk about Michael Scott. At the time of the girls' murders, he was a sophomore enrolled in a special education class at McCollum High School. He repeated the 10th grade and dropped out a year after the killings. The school's assistant principal, Charles, remembered him as a tall student, at least 6 feet, with long blonde hair who was friendly and was ultimately surprised at his arrest in 1999. A year before, in 1998, he married his wife, Janine, and helped raise her young daughter while working part-time at a repair shop. Before that, he previously did maintenance work at a Boy Scout camp, so that's a little bit about him. Now, one detail that stood out to me during the research in this case is that a few months before the murders and before transferring to Lanier High School, one of the girls, Eliza, briefly attended McCollum High School, the same high school that Forrest, Robert, and Michael went to. Eliza, Robert, and Michael were all 17 years old, so it is possible that maybe their paths crossed. Maybe they shared classes or saw each other, passing in the hallways. But again, reports and faculty state that the boys were in alternative classes, so that might not be the case at all. And as for Forrest, he was 15 years old, so he too maybe could have just crossed paths with Eliza as they were walking around school, but of course that is not known or 100% confirmed. It's possible that this fact means nothing at all, but I thought it was a connection worth noting. Now, the lives of these 4 men were all over the media when they were arrested in 1999. People really believed that these were the guys behind the murders. In the docuseries, John said that he was ready to pull out the green shirt once again when he heard the news. But when he asked what investigators had on these 4 guys, he was told that the only thing they had was their confession. And not even from all of them, just 2 of them. Again, only from Robert and Michael. John remembers thinking to himself, that's it. That's like a 2-legged stool. There needed to be hard evidence against them, and there was no physical evidence linking the 4 men to the murders. So this worried John a lot. Now, not only John, but also Michael Scott's defense attorney, Carlos Garcia, explained that when he first read Michael's written confession, he thought, people don't usually confess to something they didn't do. But once he compared it to the crime scene report and photos, he saw that many details didn't match. If Michael really was there, why would he get so many things wrong? Carlos then studied Michael's interrogation video and compared it to a well-known book on interrogation practices in the US called Criminal Interrogations and Confessions. This book explains the Reed 9-step interrogation method, which can sometimes lead to false confession. Carlos said that Michael's biggest mistake was trusting the police. In the video, Michael even told investigators what his options were, telling them, 1, I'm lying, 2, I don't remember. Those are the only 2 options I have. But Carlos explained that there was a third option that Michael didn't even consider, that the investigators themselves were lying. But he just didn't consider that because he believed that police would never lie. In fact, both Michael and Robert swore that they were never near the yogurt shop that night. But Carlos says that investigators used tactics that the, quote, interrogation Bible specifically warns against, like feeding false details. For example, Robert said that he thought he was at the movies that night, but when investigators told him that that wasn't true, that movie wasn't even playing, he believed them and started doubting himself. That's how false memories and false confessions can happen. The docuseries also includes Robert Schomer, a memory expert for the defense, who talks about how memories work. He said they aren't like videotapes that you can play back. Instead, they are more like puzzle pieces, and when pieces are missing, the brain fills in the gaps with assumptions or information from others. others. Over time, you can believe that those, filled in details are real, which is how false memories form. Robert says, quote, "You have some puzzle pieces. You put them down on the table, but there are a lot of gaps. Well, memory hates these gaps. You don't want an incomplete puzzle. So basically, from inferences, from assumptions, from incorporations of information from other people, these pieces are literally created and they fill in the gaps. The next time someone asks you, what did you see or what do you remember seeing, all the pieces are there, the ones that you saw and the ones that you created." Michael's lawyer, Carlos Garcia, argued that this is exactly what happened during his interrogation. Investigators told Michael that his brain was like a VCR and that all the memories were recorded, even if he didn't remember them. Then they began feeding him suggestions. For example, they said, "Hey Michael, you were telling me that you thought the girls were tied up." Then they would jump to, what were they tied up with? Michael then started guessing, with a shoelace, with napkins, with cords, until he finally said the right one, which was their own clothes. The investigators then reinforced that detail as if Michael had remembered it himself. Carlos says that Michael began, commingling his memories and that's the problem. That's how false memories are created, which in turn, Carlos says, led to Michael's false confession. And well, basically the same thing was argued for Robert. The memory expert says that you don't know if a confession is real or fake, which is why juries exist to make that judgment. But, he did say that juries should know how certain techniques and procedures that investigators use increase the probability of false confessions. As for Paul, he explained that to him, a confession is only real if it includes details the suspects couldn't have known unless they were actually there. He pointed to Robert's confession, where Robert described Amy's body position, lying on her stomach. He even raised one arm, reenacting the position while talking about this. Now, that detail hadn't been released to the public, so Paul believed that Robert must have actually seen it, or else how else would he have known, Paul also said that the men's confessions backed each other up. For example, in Michael's interrogation, he says that he didn't essay the girls, that he tried, but that he couldn't because he couldn't get it up. And when Robert was questioned, he said the same thing, that Michael didn't essay one of the girls because he couldn't get it up, that he tried but ultimately didn't. But again, Michael's defense, Carlos, pushed back on this and brought up something else that he says proves Robert and Michael's confessions were false: the fire. At first, investigators thought that the fire started on a shelf in the back near the bodies. Burn patterns showed a V shape on the wall behind the shelf, which Carlos said proved that the fire began there, on the shelf, not on the girls. However, in Michael's confession, he said that the fire started on the victims' bodies, which didn't match the crime scene. Carlos accused the prosecutors of changing the story to fit the confessions, but Paul denied that. He said that a fire expert testified that the fire could have and actually did start on the girls and then eventually spread to the shelf. Paul says that changing how the fire began to match the confessions was not the case at all. So that's just a bit of the nature of the arguments on both sides of the case. In 2001 and 2002, Robert and Michael's trials began. But again, there was no physical evidence linking them to the murders. So to convince the juries that they were guilty was going to be tough. But the state brought in a lot of witnesses to testify. One person was one of Michael's old friends named Amanda. She said that she recalled Michael pacing in her living room shortly after the murders, and she told him, you can talk to me, we're friends, you can trust me, like if there's something you want to say it. And that's when he blurted out, "I did it." But still, this wasn't enough to convince the jury. "I did it" could have reference to a lot of things. Another witness the state brought in was a psychologist who treated Robert in the spring of 1992 for anger and depression. Another was Robert's father, who had reported his son as missing on the night of the murders. But overall, the strongest evidence that the state had for both Robert and Michael was their own words, their own confessions that were recorded on video and shown to the jury. In the end, 3 weeks after the trials began, the jury found Robert guilty of capital murder in 2001, and he was sentenced to death. His defense, Joe, says that it was one of the worst days of his life as a lawyer. And the same outcome happened for Michael after his trial in 2002. But he was sentenced to life in prison, not death. As for Forrest, he ended up getting released on bail and went back home to his family in June of 2000. 2 grand juries didn't indict him. And as for Maurice, he was next to be tried. But his trial actually never happened because there was not enough evidence to ensure a conviction since, again, he never confessed. So he was let go in January of 2003 after being in prison for around 3 years. And, even though investigators thought that Maurice was the ringleader, but had no evidence to prove that, they still weren't going to give up. They believe the evidence is there. They just have to find it. For years, there were no more updates in the case. Maurice and Forrest went on to live their lives outside of prison, and Michael and Robert were serving their sentences. But a big update was that 4 years into his sentence, Robert was actually given a life sentence instead of a death penalty, after the US Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to execute someone for a crime that they committed when they were a minor. Then, years later, in 2006 and 2007, Robert and Michael's sentences were completely overturned. They remained in prison after this, but it was a Sixth Amendment violation that overturned their convictions. An appeals court said that the prosecutors wrongly used Robert's confession against Michael and vice versa. The US Supreme Court ruled that this was unconstitutional, since both men had the right to face their accuser. And by relying on each other's confessions instead of live testimony from each other, the court said that their Sixth Amendment right was violated. Eliza's mother just said that she couldn't believe what she was hearing, that their rights were violated, yet their girls were murdered. Eliza's sister Sonora said that it ruins your sense of fairness, and it was really hard for the families hearing that the men's convictions were overturned. So Robert and Michael were still in prison after the overturned convictions and were awaiting a new trial. In March of 2008, while preparing to be back in court, prosecutors said that they found a DNA profile from Amy's vaginal swab of a male whose identity was not known yet, and it didn't belong to any of the 4 boys, even Robert, who confessed to essaying one of the girls. So where did that DNA come from? District Attorney Rosemary said that DNA evidence could play a role in the new trial, since the confession suggested that one of the girls had been essayed. At the original trial, no foreign DNA was found because testing methods required large samples. With newer YSTR technology, a full male DNA profile was discovered from the small sample that they had, but it didn't match any of the 4 men accused: Robert, Michael, Maurice, or Forrest. The DA, Rosemary, said that this DNA could very well be the result of contamination, not necessarily ruling out the 4 men, maybe from the essay but not the murders. Paul Johnson agreed with this contamination theory, explaining that YSTR can pick up tiny traces of skin cells, and that the crime scene had so many people going in and out always, with customers, delivery drivers, firefighters, police, everyone. Investigators even tested over 200 men who could have had contact with the shop and the crime scene, but found no matches. On the other hand, the defense argued that a DNA profile from a vaginal swab could not just be brushed off as contamination, insisting that it had to belong to the killer. Only then. Because of where this sample was found, this was very important. And again, it didn't match any of the 4 men. Now, the current lead investigator, Dan Jackson, appeared in the HBO docuseries as well, and he spoke about the contamination topic. He pointed out that that same male profile was found years later across different pieces of evidence handled by different labs and people. He said the odds of the same profile repeatedly appearing by random contamination would be like, quote, winning the lottery over and over. But he said that he can't confirm anything until he finds out who it belongs to. According to Bruce Budell, a DNA expert, DNA isn't proof of guilt or innocence. All it is a sample belonging to someone, which rules out others, and it's up to the investigation to find out how it got there and when. And since the DNA sample is so small, there's only so many times that it can be tested before the sample is all gone. So yeah, as you guys can see, this DNA found has been a tricky element in the case on top of everything else. And the jurors who were on Robert and Michael's trial said that after hearing all of this, they were no longer convinced beyond reasonable doubt that they were the ones who did it, and if they had known about the DNA at the time of sentencing, they wouldn't have voted them guilty. The DA, Rosemary, said that she could not retry Robert and Michael until she knew who this DNA belonged to, but testing was going to take time.
I remain confident that Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott are both responsible for the deaths at the yogurt shop.
A mystery piece of DNA showed up as part of the continuing investigation, and they couldn't put it on any 4 of those guys.
It would not be prudent to risk a trial until we know the nature of the involvement of this unknown male.
So in June of 2009, Robert and Michael were released from prison on personal bond after prosecutors told Judge Michael Lynch that they were not ready for the new trial that was set to begin the following month, and they asked for a delay. DA Rosemary said that she was sure that these men committed the crime and would go after them again when they were finally ready. The defense said that there was just no point, that there was no physical evidence linking them to the murders, that the gun testing didn't match, that the DNA found didn't match any of the 4 men, so there was ultimately nothing. However, Paul Johnson says that the reports of the ballistics didn't absolutely clear Maurice like the defense was saying. Again, the results were inconclusive. They couldn't confirm for sure whether or not, those came from Maurice's gun or for sure that it didn't. And authorities knew that Maurice had access to other guns, so it could have been another gun that, according to Maurice, Forrest took from him that night. So Paul says that even though the gun testing was inconclusive, that didn't mean he was completely clear. Lots of things were being looked at again in preparation for the new trial. A few months later, when everyone was back in the courtroom in October of 2009, prosecutors were faced with an ultimatum from Judge Mike Lynch: either proceed to trial or he would grant a motion from the defense to dismiss the case based on the defendant's right to a speedy trial. And in the end, the retrial ended in dismissal. So Robert and Michael were now 100% free men. Their defense said that now it was time to find the person actually responsible, or persons. Robert and Michael returned home to their families. They celebrated getting out of prison, finally out of the legal system, and they tried to move on with their lives. 1 year after Michael and Robert were released, Maurice was actually shot and killed in Austin. What began as a routine traffic stop ended with Maurice stabbing an officer, and he was shot. His family says that after the yogurt shop murders, the past followed him, and he just never trusted the police after that, and he had run-ins with them numerous times. In an interview 7 years after the murders, Maurice told Paul Johnson the way Hector Polanco scared the living crap out of him when he was 16 years old, and how he just feared the cops ever since that day. Michael's defense, Carlos, says that he really believes that Maurice's PTSD is what killed him. But as for Robert, Michael, and Forrest, they have all moved on from this. As far as other updates in the case, in 2017, Austin detective Jay Swan tried to get new leads by comparing the male DNA found on one of the victims to the US YSTR database, which held over 29,000 samples intended for population research at the National Center for Forensic Science at the University of Central Florida. And he got a hit. But the database was for population research, so samples were anonymously submitted. The FBI had submitted the sample, which came from a federally convicted offender, arrestee, or detainee. However, they refused to release the donor's identity, citing federal laws that protect their privacy. This deeply frustrated investigators and the victims' families, who felt that the law was protecting the killer instead of the girls.
It really took a toll on me because, from what I understand, this guy could be a prisoner or he's in prison. And as far as I'm concerned, when you go to prison, you lose your right to vote and you lose all other rights. So here we have the FBI protecting a criminal that could help us in our murder case.
Everybody needs a resolution, I think. Not that it's going to change anything for us. I mean, our life was changed forever that one night. And we do the best we can. But it would just help to know that whoever did it is paying the price that we feel like by law that they should serve. I mean, they're gonna answer for it one day. But I would like to see something happen here and now.
They're out there and they've had life for, after this year it'll be 29 years.
So something needs to happen.
Right. I mean, it's not fair. They're out there living their life, and I hope it's miserable. But
Detectives eventually asked Congressman Michael McCall to pressure the FBI, and after 3 years, the FBI agreed to retest the DNA, and the original profile had only 16 markers, which was too little to match with anyone. Millions could have that same profile. Usually 67 or even 1,000 markers are used in genetic genealogy, so this sample wasn't ideal, but it was all investigators had to work with. In 2020, advanced testing increased it to 25 markers. While this gave investigators a stronger profile, it no longer matched the sample in the Florida database, so that could no longer be a lead. The DNA still belongs to someone though, and with technology improving, there is hope, that it will one day identify the person responsible. The two men seen by witnesses sitting in the booth that night have never been identified. It's possible that this DNA belongs to one of them, but to this day, their identities remain unknown. They could be the key to solving this case. In 2022, a new law called the Homicide Victims victims' Families' Rights Act was passed, inspired, partly by this case. It gives the families of cold case victims the ability to push for federal reviews using the latest technology. There is still hope that this DNA or another lead will finally solve the murders. As for Paul Johnson and his thoughts after looking at all of this, he said, looking back, he wishes he had focused more on Mac and the other kids who hung around the creek and the gun that Maurice talked about in an earlier interview. Now, remember, I mentioned Mac or like someone named Mace earlier, and Maurice had originally claimed that the gun used was kind of like a community weapon that everyone shared, and Forrest supposedly told him that Mac had hidden it under the bridge near the creek. Paul thought that maybe this could have been one of the guns used in the murders. With so many tips coming in about Maurice, Paul now believes he should have pressed harder to get more information on him from the Creek crowd. In the docuseries, both Mac and another, former Creek person, which is, how they refer to them, named Kevin, were actually in it, and they pushed back on Maurice's claims. They said that the idea of hiding a gun under a bridge was ridiculous, and that if any of them had enough money to buy a gun back then, they wouldn't have just left it under the creek. Both insisted that they never hurt anyone, that they just hung out and tried to look cool, but that they weren't violent people. Mac also told the docuseries crew that Maurice got the name wrong. Maurice referred to him as Mace, but no one ever called him that. His name is Mac Ludden, and he believes that Maurice singled him out because it was just convenient. Mac said that he and his friend group spent time around the creek, and Maurice knew that. Plus, Mac explained that their groups didn't really get along. Both thought that they were the cool ones, so they kind of, like butted heads a lot. So overall, he thinks that Maurice probably saw him as an easy target to blame. I highly recommend that you guys go watch the docuseries so you guys can hear more from Mac and just, that whole perspective about the creek. Now, as for the victims' families, they still have unanswered questions 33 years and 8 months later. Their girls' photos and biographies remain framed at the Austin Cold Case Unit office, and a 3D reconstruction of the yogurt shop the night of the murders is underneath them, reminding authorities every day that the case has faces and lives. It's not just paperwork. Dan says that he is very hopeful that with new DNA technology, they can take items that were unable to be tested before and, get some answers. In the docuseries, he says, quote, "We are going to solve this case one day. I want the public to know that."
I couldn't remember their smiles and the things that made them who they were, and I can remember it. It's fading in my old age, The smells and the sound of them being here are fading.
It's a long time, but the pain is still here, If I could just stop missing her. That's the whole thing, is I still miss her.
The docuseries wraps up with Sergeant John Jones speaking. He says that he used to hide every December 6th, every year that went by with no answers to give to the girls' families to bring them justice. He would retreat and just disappear by himself, and he says that that day will live in infamy and will probably be that way as long as it's still unsolved. I do truly hope that one day he gets to wear his green striped shirt, the day that this case is solved. Even if he isn't the one delivering the news to the families, I hope that he gets to take the shirt out of the garment bag that it's been hanging in his closet for the past 33 years. After the murders, the girls' families were left trying to rebuild their lives while also trying to cope with the tremendous amount of grief that they carried. Eliza's sister, Sonora, often thinks about how she frequently took things to Eliza at the yogurt shop while she worked, and that the very night of the murders, Eliza had actually called her asking her to come and hang out. But Sonora couldn't leave without permission, and their father wasn't home yet. She has carried the belief that if she had gone there, she might have become the 5th victim. For years, she wrestled with survivor's guilt, wishing that she had been there, before, slowly starting to learn that life could still hold beauty after this. As she grew older, Sonora felt conflicted, both disgusted at the public's fascination with the murders and with theories and just, with not even thinking about it clearly, but she was also in awe at how the case continued to shock people decades later. She realized how rarely her family actually spoke about Eliza after, the murders, and how so many memories of her sister had started to fade away. She didn't want that, she didn't want to forget her sister, and, one interview that she saw pushed her to revisit those memories more, and she began writing them in her journal, determined to never let them slip away. She was watching an interview where someone was talking about Eliza, and they were talking, about Eliza's life and bringing up things that Sonora couldn't even remember. She was like, wait, this person knows more about my sister than I do. Today, Sonora describes her feelings as kind of an ongoing torture, knowing that there has never been justice. Now, a therapist, she devotes her life to helping others, but she says that the trauma never leaves. Even today, when she thinks about the yogurt shop, her body still reacts as if it were that night all over again. Amy's brother, Sean, remembers how happy he was when Amy arrived home after she was born. He held her in his arms and was just so happy to have a little sister and be a big brother. He says that not a day goes by without thinking of Amy, Jennifer, Sarah, or Eliza. But as time goes on and the older he gets, he says the less he can remember of his little sister. It's a feeling that Sonora relates to. It's heartbreaking to listen to them talk about how their memories with their siblings are fading away. As for the girls' parents, Jennifer and Sarah's mother, Barbara, and their stepfather, Skip, surrounded themselves with reminders of the girls. They moved homes, and at their new place, they decorated a room with their daughter's belongings. The bed that they once slept in, their school uniforms, their pom-poms, their trophies, books, FFA jackets, even stuffed animals. Friends of Jennifer and Sarah even visited the new house too. Some of Sarah's friends spent one night there during the Christmas season just to feel close to her memory. Other of Sarah's friends had grown up, gotten married, and moved away, which Barbara said was really difficult to accept because it reminded her of the milestones not only Sarah, but also Jennifer should have been living through themselves. It's just so sad that she lost both of her daughters, her only children. As for Amy's parents, they also moved after the murders. They started focusing on building a farm and also a house, trying to create something steady to hold on to. Eliza's mother, Maria, moved on to a new house as well, and Eliza's younger sister went to boarding school, filling her time with things like skiing. But the grief caused some issues in her life, and she encountered some behavioral difficulties because of it. Each family coped differently, but all of them were searching for a way to carry the weight of their loss. A few years after the murders in 1994, the families reached a $12 million settlement from the owners of the yogurt shop and the strip mall that it was located in. Eliza's father, James, wasn't a part of this lawsuit, but Jennifer and Sarah's mom, Barbara, their dad, Mike, and stepdad, Skip, were a part of it, as well as Eliza's mother, Maria, and Amy's parents, Bob and Pam. They all decided to use some of the money to make a difference. Together, they helped create a nonprofit called We Will Not Forget, SAJE, with the name formed from the first letter of the girls' names. The purpose focused on educating young people and preventing violent crimes, especially in fast food places. A lot of people believe that the girls shouldn't have been alone that night, that there should have at least been, a male coworker there just in case, or, there should have been better security measures just to protect the girls. I mean, they were, young teens working alone, closing the shop at 11 p.m. at night, so it's definitely important to bring awareness of, how we can better protect ourselves and changes that, these fast food places can make. One of the rules that the yogurt shop had was to, lock the door once, closing time got closer. They would lock the door, and if there were still customers inside, the girls would just unlock it and let the customers out. That way, no new people could come in. So, that was one safety precaution that they had, but, still, a lot of people wonder if that was enough. Barbara and Skip also worked toward building a lodge in the Child Inc. ranch to honor Jennifer and Sarah. As for Skip, Jennifer and Sarah's stepfather, he was a manager at Dell Computer, but years after the murders, he was called to law after dealing with lawyers and the court systems, and just wanted to study law, as well as saying, quote, "I have learned that there really is a need for lawyers. I'm interested in public interest law and alternative dispute resolutions. Most of us common folks don't know how to deal with legal situations. I'd like to be in a situation where I could help some of these nonprofit organizations that have been a help to me, and I'd like to help people assert their rights." And in 1994, he began studying law at the University of Tulsa, happy knowing that he would go on to make a difference. Even though the settlement provided opportunities, Barbara said that no amount of money could ever replace her children. On top of that, Barbara explained that when people in public recognized them and offered condolences, it was still really difficult and just brought up a lot of emotions. Still, she and the other parents stayed committed to keeping their daughter's memories alive. For them, honoring Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy meant working so that no other family would ever have to go through the pain that they did. To close today's video, I want to share something that Eliza's sister, Sonora, says in the HBO docuseries. As she spoke, old home videos of Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy played on the screen, showing the girls laughing, smiling, and just being themselves. And the way that Sonora put her feelings into words really stayed with me. She explained that when it comes to carrying traumatic memories, there's a common belief that the way to heal is simply to tell the story over over and over again. But she feels like it takes more than that. For her, the key is being surrounded by support and compassion when sharing those painful memories. You know, having people there who are willing to sit with you, listen, and just truly witness her story. Sonora believes that in that process, something powerful happens. The act of telling, the act of listening create connection, understanding, and healing on both sides. She said this can actually change the way the memory exists inside of you. Not erase it, but transform how it lives with you. And I thought that was really meaningful, and it just, like I said, it really stuck with me, and I'm sure it will for a lot of you. The families are still waiting for justice and just hope that someone will come forward or that new science will bring something to light. 33 years and 8 months have gone by with no answers, and the person responsible for taking the lives of these 4 young, beautiful girls needs to pay for what they did. If you know anything, please contact the Austin Police Department at 512-477-3588. Or you can also contact the APD Cold Case Unit at 512-974-5250 or contact Crime Stoppers at 512-472-TIPS. All of that will be in the description box down below, and honestly, my condolences go out to all of the loved ones, and I hope that they get answers soon. This is just so unfair. It breaks my heart hearing how the families just don't know what happened to their loved one 33 years later. I can't even imagine what they're going through, and I'm happy that this documentary has come out and that now a new set of eyes are listening to this case and hearing this case and seeing their faces. I just truly hope that someone out there knows something and that they'll just reveal it. You know, at this point, it's been 33 years later. Like, just come forward with the truth and just help these families get closure. It was a really beautiful documentary to watch, and I recommend that you guys go check it out. You know, I was seeing comments online talking about how boring the documentary was and how, like, oh my gosh, I thought something new was going to come out of this, or I thought, you know, it was going to be like a better documentary, but it's so boring. I don't even know why people are saying that. I think that's a disgusting thing to say. These are families that are being vulnerable and putting themselves out there to talk about the most horrific night of their life and talk about a horrifying thing that happened to these young girls. And yet people were here saying that it was so boring. I thought that was horrible. And like normally, like I don't even talk about, you know, negativity or anything like that. I thought it was worth mentioning here because I think it's so important to ignore that. If you guys see people saying that it's boring or whatever, like who cares? Like don't even listen to that. Go watch the documentary. Go show up for these families. Go show them the support. Go listen to them and keep sharing the story and keep sharing their faces. Again, thank you so much to everyone for being here and for taking the time out of your day to listen to their story and for keeping their names alive. I would love to know what you guys think about this down below, and if there are any updates, I will definitely let you guys know. If you guys haven't watched my last video, I talk about the case of Kaylee Sawyer, a 23-year-old woman from Oregon who was walking late at night in her own neighborhood when she ran into a campus security officer. After that, she disappeared, and she was betrayed by someone meant to protect the community. You guys can click the upcoming screen to hear about what happened to Kaylee Sawyer, along with another past video. I also wanted to share an announcement with you guys. We just revamped the newsletter, which was previously known as the Familia newsletter, and it is now True Crime Jackie News. Everything I do is always led with respect for the victims and their families, with the mission of spreading awareness together across platforms, and this newsletter is another way to do that. You know, each month I'll be sharing helpful resources, information on missing persons to share their face in another space. I'll be sharing safety and expert tips, organizations that you should be aware of, and a small Q&A section at the end to answer your questions and to connect with you through this platform. If you're not signed up yet, you guys can do so by clicking the link in the description. Thank you guys again for being so amazing, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, familia.